Welcome to Bears on Tap, hosted by Kyle Juice Michalski, Quentin Q. Crisco, Sonny Verma, and the one and only Ron Luce, bringing you all the news, analysis, and opinions on the charter franchise, Chicago Bears.
And welcome back to another episode of Bears on Tap. My name is Quentin Crisco. I'm joined, as always, by Ron Luce and a very special guest today, Arif Hasan, to talk about, within our series here, Knowing the Enemy. We're talking Vikings today. So, Arif, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm doing good. And I forgot to mention within that, make sure to go check out Arif's work. He's chief writer over at WideLeft.football. That's a website. It doesn't need to be .com. It can be .football because it's a lot cooler sounding. But make sure to go check out his work. Some incredible journalism over there. But Ron, how are you doing this afternoon? Or this evening, I guess?
Oh, I'm good, man. I'm good. It's been a while since I've been on the mic with you, Q, talking Bears football, and I'm very excited to get into this thing with our guests. Because I'll be honest with you, I think the most fascinating team in the NFC North, not named the Chicago Bears this year, is the Minnesota Vikings. So very much looking forward to our discussion today.
One of the widest ranges of outcomes, I think. There's a lot a lot of ways that I could see this thing working and ways that I could see stuff kind of cracking a little. I'm not sure which way it's going to teeter. But with that being said, let's just jump in on the questions here. Number one here, Arif, what is a reasonable goal for the Vikings in 2024?
The Vikings have always set themselves up with the goal of making the playoffs. Obviously, that's a little bit further out of reach without Kirk Cousins than with him. But yeah, I'd say it's just outside of reasonable to make the playoffs, which means, a winning record, I suppose, is the reasonable goal. Which, it's always frustrating because then you don't get the draft pick either. You don't get the playoffs, you don't get the draft pick. But, as an organization, tanking is kind of not on your radar. So with that in mind, it's a winning record.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you said, it's bittersweet with that, right? Like you can only celebrate so many like week 18 victories when you don't make the playoffs, and you're just sitting there going, well, we're kind of in purgatory at pick 16 here, or whatever the pick might be.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I feel like too, just with that purgatory as well, right? Like how many teams actually draft and develop incredibly well from purgatory? Like there's a few, right? Naturally, you want to be picking high up in the draft. And Arif, with that in mind, what would you call the strength of this roster, right? Because I think to most fans in historic years, there were elements of this roster that you could make the argument for being the strength, but obviously a lot of big names have left, right? Danielle Hunter being probably the most notable recent name to have left the organization via free agency. Where do you see the strength of this team right now entering the 2024 season?
I'd say it's probably wide receiver. I think that if you go, player by player, right, you probably pick like safety or something like that. I think that makes sense, and I think it's a fair answer, but Justin Jefferson is so good. He's just so good. It kind of overwhelms everything else. And I wrote a piece, to plug myself, I wrote a piece about, the contract that he received, which is actually a much bigger contract than I think a lot of people realize. And it puts a lot more on the Vikings than a lot of these other big wide receiver contracts. And I'm totally comfortable with that because I was digging into the data to see kind of the impact that he has on defensive structure and things like that. And it is really massive in a way that anyone aside from Tyreek Hill doesn't really have. And given that, and given that Jordan Addison, who we'll see how many games he's eligible to play this year given his recent troubles, but given that Jordan Addison looked pretty good last year, and there's a role in the offense for him as a deep threat, and given how effective they've been at making these other kind of tertiary receivers useful in their various roles, people like Braden Powell, who played a lot better last year than I expected. I see it as a strength. Again, not player for player, but I think that given how kind of titanic Jefferson can be, it's hard for me to pick a different position there.
And with that comment, because I love what you had to say, I feel like the Vikings, even in like our lifetimes, have always been able to make like that third and fourth receiver on the roster is somehow dangerous, even if they're not the big names or anything like that. You guys lose KJ Osborne, he heads to New England. What should fans expect out of a guy like Brandon Powell? And do you think he's up for the challenge of taking over kind of that number 3 role in this Vikings offense that historically has been still a very prominent position to play, despite being third on the depth chart?
Yeah. I remember when Jarius Wright left, there was a huge concern about what would happen there. And like you said, KJ Osborne kind of stepped up, and it's just been an area where there's been a level of continuity I'm kind of surprised at seeing, because they don't invest a ton of resources into whichever player ends up emerging. Brandon Powell looked very good last year, but I don't think he's, earned the right to win the job. There's going to be a camp competition there. Jalen Naylor was actually he was on pace or on track to win the job out of camp last year, but he got injured, and he got injured for a very long time. And so when he came back, the Vikings were pretty comfortable with KJ Osborne. They were pretty comfortable with Brandon Powell. Obviously, both of them experienced injuries at some point, so we did see Jalen Naylor, see the field. But at that point, he'd been so out of sync with the offense, and maybe he shouldn't have won the competition. He shouldn't have been on pace to win the competition. It's always a possibility, but I think that there's a lot of optimism about him, and so he could win. Trent Sherfield, he's in the mix, and he's been effective for Buffalo and for San Francisco. But I think for the most part, Brandon Powell, who's primarily kind of an underneath guy, really good at winning these choice routes, where as a slot receiver, based off of the leverage of like the linebacker or the nickel corner, you've got the ability to pick. He's very good at that. I wouldn't, send him deep or anything like that. But for the most part, I think that he does a pretty effective job in those inside choice routes, and he does have some impact on the outside. We know that Justin Jefferson's deadly from the slot. We know that Jordan Addison can stretch the field from the slot. So they probably don't want their wide receiver 3 to be just a slot guy. And I think that they've got a couple of options available to make sure that, they can put a guy on the outside.
And to your point with, to rewind it a little bit back to, you mentioned how much Justin Jefferson kind of can dictate or shift the defenses and how that impacts the way that the Vikings offense is played. I was kind of just a little bit of I don't want to say hater, but I want to say concerned about Jordan Addison last year, because I was one of those guys who's sitting there going, I love the tape. I love what I've seen, but this dude's sub 170 pounds and runs over a 4.5 40, and history says that is not a good mix. And as the season went on, like the first quarter of the season last year, I felt like a lot of his yards came from a few busted coverages, but then it just kept happening and kept happening. And he kept making plays where it's just like, I don't know what to think of his tape on that play, but he made that play. And is there a lot of choice routes within what the Vikings do and a lot of kind of variability within that to where a receiver can be more of a difference maker without looking like a difference maker all the time?
Yeah, I think the thing that is really interesting about that is that a lot of Jordan Addison's production came when Justin Jefferson was out, when he was injured, which is, I think, really fascinating to the point that you're making. And you're right. The history of receivers that run, 4.5 40s that are under 190 pounds, and he's well under 190 pounds. Mm-hmm. It's really poor. It's you look at the data, and I think I wrote a piece when he was drafted. I was like, I don't know about this. The data is not great. It's very rare, but it's kind of difficult to fully understand why, some of these plays materialize as consistently as they do for him. But I do think that he's got a pretty good understanding of leverage and a pretty good understanding of what opposing defenders are trying to do. Now, my understanding of the offense is that he wasn't given that many option routes. Brandon Powell was given option routes. Justin Jefferson, obviously, he can just do whatever he wants. TJ Hawkinson, when he was healthy, he was, given a lot of option routes. These are players that, know the playbook and are well trusted by Kevin O'Connell. From my understanding, Jordan Addison wasn't actually given that many. And so, his job was to run the route he was assigned, however he was going to run it, manipulate defenders however he's going to do it, but run the route that he was assigned. And, from there, he still, was able to find himself with acres of space sometimes. And I think for him, it's a lot of, especially if you take a look at what he was doing at Pitt more than even at USC, for him, it was a lot of manipulation, a lot of really forcing cornerbacks to read and jump the wrong route. And so it can look like a busted coverage or it can look like a poor pass off in zone, but sometimes, if you're a zone corner or a zone safety and your job is to read inside out and the guy inside looks like he's breaking instead of going deep, you're out of position then. And it can look like a busted coverage. So I think that that's a lot of what he's doing, and he's a much more mature route runner than I think, his reputation would suggest, or what it looked like a lot of times at USC. Like I think that he does have like those route running chops in a way that I didn't initially anticipate.
Yeah, and to be clear, I came off the worries after like trying to think about it, whereas like no one gets that lucky. It's like there has to be some reason why this is happening, because it just keeps happening, right?
Yeah. At some point, you just kind of have to trust the consistency of it.
Yeah. Now, on the flip side of that, what's one area of this roster that you think could prevent the Vikings from reaching their goals this year?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think cornerback is probably it. It's one of those areas where over time it's kind of easy to convince yourself that this is an area where they've got some answers. But I think if you evaluate it with like a fresh mindset, it is actually very concerning. Like the names are fine. Like Shaq Griffin is a name where you're like, hey man, that guy's made Pro Bowls, but he hasn't played well for like 3 years. Like the odds of him actually playing at a reasonably high level are somewhat low. Now I trust Brian Flores to maximize what he can do, but still, he was an injury replacement for the Texans, and so when Derek Stingley came back from injury, he was benched and then cut. And I wonder if he was cut as a favor to him so that he could start somewhere. But he goes to Carolina and he's playing, and he's not playing well there. And a guy who's cut mid-season, no matter the reason, it always kind of raises some alarm bells. And Carolina didn't, make an effort to retain him. So I'm concerned about him, and I think that it's probably smarter to view him more with suspicion than to think about him as somebody who won a Pro Bowl back in like 2019, right? So I'm a little bit concerned there. Caleb Evans is a guy I've always been optimistic about, but in terms of his actual play on the field, it's been okay at best. It hasn't been wonderful. Obviously, there was going to be a little bit more competition at the position there. They drafted Kyrie Jackson in the 4th round. Unfortunately, he passed away. And so the Vikings, who do have an extra roster spot, they might spend it on a veteran corner and bolster the spot. They're not super confident in the players that they have outside of that potential starting 3. Mekhi Blackman is kind of a slot only guy. His size would suggest that you don't really want him on the outside. And he's been okay in some situations, but he's clearly had a lot of mental lapses where he can be exploited. That could just be a young guy. And then Andrew Booth has never really shown much. Jay Ward, who's played both safety and nickel corner, I think that they kind of want to keep him in the safety room nowadays. And Najee Thompson is just a special teams only player. So there's not a ton of depth there. There's not a huge ceiling. I do think Byron Murphy's pretty good, but he's probably in an ideal situation, a really high level second corner, right? He's like the Antonio Cromartie or the DJ Reed of whichever version of the Jets defense you want to pick, right? So it is a concern. And I think that, if they have to constantly play catch up, given whoever they have at quarterback, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, so thinking about who's actually starting, because you said Byron Murphy is, he does his best work in the nickel, but Mekhi Blackman is probably a nickel, and there are times where I'm not even sure I'm confident what position Josh Metellus plays. I feel like he's in the nickel sometimes. He's at safety sometimes. He's at linebacker, maybe even edge rusher at times. I feel like he's everywhere. How does this kind of play out with who is actually on the field in a base defense for a nickel? I guess I say base. I mean nickel defense.
Yeah. The thing about a Brian Flores defense is that it is, remarkably versatile and responsive to opponents, and it attempts to maximize kind of what they have available to them. Josh Metellus, Yeah, I don't know what position he plays. You know, he meets in the safety room, right? Like he gets coached
Yeah.
by, you know, the defensive backs group, but like, you know, he plays a lot of linebacker in what you'd probably call, you know, a nickel package, which would make it a dime package if he's a safety, right? He plays a lot of nickel corner because he actually, I mean, even when Mike Zimmer was the head coach and also running the defense, in camp he would do a lot of man coverage stuff, you know, for a safety, which you watch him at Michigan, and you're like, hey, this guy is like a box safety only. Like he can't play free safety, he can't play nickel corner. And then you know he shows up in camp and he's clamping Adam Thielen. You're like, that's new. That's interesting, right? But yeah, no, he plays a lot of different positions because he like meets in the safety room and he meets with the defensive backs and stuff like that. You'd call him a safety, and that's probably like if you were to franchise him, which probably you wouldn't, but if you were to franchise him, he'd be franchised at the safety position. So yeah, in a lot of like you know your standard defense, you know we don't want to use the word base defense because that implies three linebackers or something, but in a standard defense. It's probably Josh Metellus is the fifth defensive back. And so it's Byron Murphy on the outside and Shaq Griffin on the outside. And then maybe you could, I mean, depending on what the matchups are, maybe you move Byron Murphy and Josh Metellus around. Maybe Josh Metellus is playing as a third linebacker. You know, who knows, right? Cameron Bynum in college was a cornerback, and so for a very brief moment of time, the Vikings would play him at cornerback when they put another safety on the field, mostly with Mike Zimmer at coach more than anything else. But that's kind of what they're doing, and I think it's going to be pretty matchup dependent. I think it's going to be dependent on kind of what players are doing what during the practice week. But I think for the most part, the snaps we'll see will have Josh Metellus on the field on nearly every down, which would mean that you're not going to get, you know, a Caleb Evans on the outside with Byron Murphy in the slot or anything like that.
Okay.
I was gonna say, I feel like Metellus, especially in like the Brian Flores scheme, right? Like that scheme that you think back to from teams like New England and things like that. Like there was always that one player on defense who you almost could just call him like a rover and just keep moving, right? Like he's gonna do a little bit of everything. You're gonna see him in different looks. You know, I've heard different variations of the term, right? Sometimes they'll call him the dog in the defense. Sometimes he's, you know, referred to as something else. It's just kind of this like unique hybrid position. And I feel like with a guy like Metellus, especially with Brian Flores being the tier and the mastermind behind the defense, is like the perfect complement to the rest of that group. And speaking of this group and obviously the concerns that you have as maybe the one position that really holds this Viking team back this year, do you think the steps forward, call it for lack of a better word, by the rest of the division add to this concern as well? Because obviously Chicago goes out, adds to DJ Moore, not just DJ Keenan Allen, it's Rome Odunze. Detroit's Detroit. You still have Sam Laporta there. Jameson Williams is expected to take that next leap. And then, of course, you still have Green Bay, who magically drafts receivers in like the 6th and 7th round, they become relevant. Does that add to that, or is it just like hey, it wouldn't matter what the division looks like? Like this is where your fear really lies.
No, I think it certainly magnifies that particular concern that the division has made some pretty significant investments in receiver, right? Like I don't know what Green Bay receivers are like even now, like which ones are going to emerge as like kind of the dominant target shares. It could be Jaden Reed, it could be Dontavian Wicks, it could be Romeo, it could be anybody, right? It could be Christian Watson. I'm a huge NDSU skeptic, so I don't think it's going to be Christian Watson, but But yeah, I mean, and like you said, you know, Jameson Williams is expected to take the next step. Chicago's done so much to add to that position. It's like without the horses to catch up to that kind of advancement for teams that you're going to play year in year out that you've always got like 6 games on the schedule for, it'll keep you behind, especially because you know the Vikings, you know, they had an extremely good defense from like weeks 4 to weeks 13. Specifically only within those weeks, you know, before and after, really awful. But they had an amazing defense in that moment of time. And a lot of that, I think, was because they did a lot of unique stuff that covered up the weaknesses that they had at cornerback. Now, with divisional opponents, that just doesn't work over time. They, like, figure it out, right? And so when you have a weakness and you cover it up, that's great in moments, but it'll be targeted. They'll figure out how you're covering up these guys. They'll figure out what you're doing to hide these guys, and they'll do as much as possible to expose them. And so at some point, talent is just going to win out. And the Vikings right now just do not have talent at corner. And especially for opponents who have experience going up against that kind of defense, that's going to be the biggest concern that you can have.
Yeah.
We have a comment from a guy named Luke Getsy asking if the big way to expose them is screens.
No, it turns out that's actually the worst decision you could make. Very tempting given all of the blitzing, but the screens just don't work. They just don't work. And if you put on the film and watch it, the screens don't work on film either. So you could be special. Your offense could be different. Your screens might work, but I would bet against it.
I couldn't even get through the coach's tape of that game, like the offensive tape. I was just like, I can't watch this anymore. This is just awful to watch.
Well, speaking of an offensive scheme that isn't complete garbage like Luke Getsy's was a year ago in Chicago, how would you, Arif, describe to somebody that's not as familiar with the Vikings just the offensive scheme that Kevin O'Connell runs? Because obviously he is a Sean McVay disciple. He's one of these bright young minds in the coaching game. It pisses me off that he's with the Vikings because I want to hate him, but I can't because he's a good coach and he's already proven that in a very short amount of time in Minnesota. But how would you describe to the common football fan, the objectives and just the offense schematically up there in Minnesota?
Yeah, I think a lot of people see, these Shanahan-McVay style schemes and like, oh, it's play action heavy. And the offense does not shy away from play action, but it is not nearly as play action heavy as, McVay's offense in Los Angeles. It's not nearly as play action heavy as Shanahan's in San Francisco, nor is it as play action heavy as, Ben Johnson's offense. And technically he's not a McVay coach, but, Jared Goff was like, these are the things I'm good at. And he was like, great, I'm going to do all of those things, right? It is a little bit more standard drop back than we're used to from that group. I think LaFleur is another good example of another play action heavy. They'll still do it again, but it's not something where they emphasize it nearly as much. Really, I mean, the goal is, what can we do to help Justin Jefferson? That's the offense, right? And that will often mean, route combinations designed to isolate him, or plays that are designed to take attention away from him. So often when they run the ball, it's not really to get the 4 yards. It's nice to get the 4 yards. It's not really to get the 4 yards. It's to make the safeties pay attention to the run game and, make them hesitate, right? Or make them, move up 2-3 yards and give you a little bit of extra time after the snap, even when there isn't a play action play. That's why they traded for TJ Hawkinson. And so it's really built off of these route combinations, which I know that's not like a unique thing to say, hey, this offense has route combinations, but it's built around these route combinations that maximize the depth of target that you can get for a Justin Jefferson. So one interesting split is that before they traded for TJ Hawkinson and after they traded for TJ Hawkinson, what depth of route Justin Jefferson would run and what depth of target, he would receive on targeted plays. And both of those went up dramatically when they had a more effective receiving threat at tight end, because very often they would have Hawkinson on the opposite side of Jefferson running a route that would capture the attention of a safety. And they saw a lot of cover 4 that year. And one of the ways to beat cover 4 is to have an opposite end receiver, in this case the tight end, engage in a crossing route, and the same side safety, the same side as Justin Jefferson, will have to nail the crossing route. That's the typical assignment in cover 4. Well, that leaves a void in the coverage, and Justin Jefferson would exploit that. Stuff like that over and over again, where they would want to find ways to get Jefferson to run these outside routes, these deep routes, so your 7, 8, and 9 routes. And once you've identified that I want Jefferson to run a corner, a post, a go, how do we enable that to happen? Is it a sail route here? I know that that's a pretty common thing in a lot of Earhart Perkins offenses, but we're going to steal it here. Is it going to be the 7, 8, 9? Is it going to be, kind of like the 3 verts that we see out of like Zampese style Air Coryell offenses? We're going to steal it and we're going to give it a West Coast name, right? So that's like, I want to answer it with like a really scheme heavy, here's the jargon, here's kind of like the tendency, but it's not that. It's can we get Justin Jefferson deep? And if not, we're fine with that too. He's going to run an 8-yard route and he's going to win it. But can we get him deep? Let's do that. That's the offense.
Well, and truly, I like that answer better than the more jargony one because it means more. You're saying something about it, not just, oh, well, that's, it's the Shanahan, West Coast McVay offense and blah. You're saying more, what is the goal of the offense, which is, I think, puts it in more English terms, more human terms of it. Now, I am interested so I have two questions for you. Let me pose it this way. One, do you think the more straight drop back elements of it that might differ from the more McVay offense is something that came more with the territory of a Kirk Cousins being your quarterback, and that's something that could change with more of a youthful approach at quarterback now? And two is about TJ Hawkinson. I'll ask when you're done. I just wanted to get it out there before I forgot it.
Sure, yeah. Actually, no, I don't think it has very much to do with Cousins because Cousins was a very play-action heavy quarterback in the previous iteration under Mike Zimmer. So they had a couple of offensive coordinators. They had two Kubiaks, Gary and his son, and then they also had Kevin Stefanski, who had learned from the Kubiaks, and those were very play-action heavy offenses. Not as much as maybe, like Lamar Jackson, which is its own thing, right? If you categorize an RPO as a play-action, it's very play-action heavy offense. And it was never top 3 in play-action percentage or anything like that, but it was very heavy play-action offense. And Kirk Cousins had this really unusual statistical quirk that actually Jalen Ramsey, of all people, had kind of identified, where he was perhaps the most consistent overperformer in play-action. So, like, one thing that we found, running data on teams doing play-action is, first, that teams should do play-action more often. But second, every team is better under play action than under center, generally speaking. But the amount that you're better is pretty unstable from year to year, except for two quarterbacks. Two quarterbacks are consistently quite a bit better under play action than not. Peyton Manning and Kirk Cousins. And, which is like, okay, yeah, sure. Interesting. And I would imagine if we did the study again, Jared Goff would show up there too. But for the most part, it's a very small cohort of people. Everybody gets better, but the amount they get better changes. Kirk Cousins is consistently a lot better at play action. And so when we saw this McVay coach come over to Minnesota, running an offense very similar to the one that Kirk Cousins ran, who has familiarity with Kirk Cousins from their shared time in Washington, we thought, man, there's going to be a ton of play action. And, McVay was like, well, this is how we want to run the ball. This is how we want to do play action. But he was like, hey, I know that Kirk Cousins is better under play action because you can suck these safeties in and do all that. But the things that we want to do, they're just a little bit easier to do under a standard drop back or under shotgun. We're going to have Justin Jefferson do this, and maybe teams' response to that is going to be to blitz. And play action is not as great against the blitz if teams know that you're not running the ball there. And Green Bay historically has actually done a really good job blowing up Vikings play action specifically. And so I think a lot of that was just like, well, the way that we want to run this offense is to make sure that Jefferson can do, X, Y, or Z thing. And if that's the case, play action is not the optimal solution to this. I mean, Kirk Cousins might be a little bit better at play action than not, but the way defenses are going to respond to this particular set of circumstances, it's not going to be great for us to engage in play action. So we might actually see more play action with, younger quarterback, or, Darnold, did reasonably well under Shanahan. Maybe they're going to introduce more of it. Getting Aaron Jones in implies some focus on the run game. So maybe we'll see more of it now, even though Kirk Cousins was like uniquely good at play action, just because you're going to want a little bit more in terms of helping hands for these guys.
Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense. And as I was thinking through the question, I was like, well, I don't know if this question really adds up because Kirk was the king of play action, but like I still felt like there was probably something there worth asking with it. Now, my second question here is about TJ Hawkinson coming off the injury. I believe he's expected to miss time to start the season at least.
Yes.
And so what's kind of the solution there? Is it just Josh Oliver's going to get the job done until he gets back, or is there something more that there is to expect, or am I just severely underrating Josh Oliver?
I mean, a little bit of everything, right? So first, to get the timeline for injury recovery, initially we expected him to be back sometime around week 8, but as we've received more updates and as the Vikings have, acted on, the things that they've needed to act on with TJ Hawkinson, that timeline has shortened. And now that they have indicated that they're considering putting him on IR instead of PUP, which would suggest that he'd be able to come back by like week 4 instead of week 6. That suggests a much earlier time frame for his return, which obviously that's very positive for a lot of reasons. But without him, I think, like I said, Hawkinson was a pretty critical component to the way that they designed that offense. I think Addison is going to play a somewhat similar role in pulling coverage away from Jefferson. But yeah, I mean, when the Vikings signed Josh Oliver, I mean, he was this wonderful blocking tight end for Baltimore, right? But coming out of the draft, he wasn't considered a blocking tight end at all. He was considered such a receiving tight end that there were occasionally, people that were like, just make him a receiver. Not as much as like with Kyle Pitts or anything like that, but he was only a receiving tight end in college. And so, this transformation has been kind of incredible to see. But when the Vikings signed him, they were like, we think that we can kind of re-unlock that element of his game. That didn't happen last year, even after TJ Hawkinson went down. So it is kind of curious to see how they'll approach this problem. They have added to the tight end room. They've added Robert Tonyan, former NFC North everything, I think.
Has he gotten all the Infinity Stones now?
He played preseason snaps with the Lions.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If you qualify that, he has captured the NFC North Infinity Stones. Yes.
Yeah. So everyone has some familiarity with Big Bobby Tonyan, or Tunyon. Sorry, forget it rhymes with Funyon. But everyone's familiar with him. They have Samus Reyes on the International Player Program, so if he doesn't make the roster, he'll still be on the roster because it's a free spot. So they might have more in the tight end room. I think they're a little bit optimistic about Nick Muse. I'm kind of not. Johnny Munt is very familiar with the offense. They like him a lot. They consider him more of a blocker, but they really, if you're going to put him in one of 3 categories, like blocker, receiver, or utility, they'd probably put him in the utility category. But I think that they're going to try, at least early in the season, to see if Josh Oliver can do it all, because there's some history to suggest that he can. I am skeptical of it, but I understand where they're coming from.
Is there any chance that you think the N'Keal Harry tight end experiment actually works out for the Vikings?
I'm glad they did it, but no, I don't think that there's a chance. So yeah, actually, so before, when you initially had asked for me to come on the show, you gave me like this whole list of like, hey, does this look good? And I don't know if N'Keal Harry was listed as receiver there, but I believe they announced his position change sometime very close to when you'd asked me to come onto the show. And it's probably a good thing because he's not a great receiver, and he does have the size. But like, these position changes are very often, hey, this is your last chance, man, and not, we're really going to make the most of you. Like, it's really usually, that. Sometimes it works out. I know that the Vikings have made position changes for players in the past that have worked out. The most recent example that I can think of is Fadi Adenabo, who switched from edge rusher to defensive tackle and was fairly good at that. But, for the most part, especially for a guy who's had a couple of years in the league already, as opposed to a guy that you switch their position coming right out of college. Again, I think it's the best move for N'Keal Harry and for the Vikings. I think the odds are low either way.
Yeah, I would think similar. I mean, it's one thing to do it as a 22-year-old, and if the guy was good enough to just be a big slot, he'd probably be a big slot by now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one of the juicier questions of the show, and one of the things that come in 8 months when I'm preparing for Bears Vikings, the part of this video I'm going to fast forward up to, as an opposing D coordinator, how would you attack the Vikings offense?
Interior pressure, whether that means trusting who your defensive tackles are or sending blitzes up the middle, whichever way you can best produce interior pressure, stunts, whatever it is, I would do that. I don't trust the interior offensive line that much. There's currently an open competition actually at left guard between Blake Brandel and Dalton Reisner. But Garrett Bradbury is pretty spotty there. And then Ed Ingram, he's had some good games and he finished the season kind of strong, but I generally regard him as a little bit of a weakness as well. And so I would try to create interior pressure, and I don't know that there's like Cousins was like pretty good at identifying, like for his reputation, he was actually pretty good against interior pressure. He was pretty good at identifying ways that teams would try to manufacture interior pressure. I don't know that I would say that about Sam Darnold, and I certainly can't say that with any confidence about a rookie, right? So I would say that that's probably the best way you could do it, because disrupting the Vikings offense, I think better comes from attacking their weaknesses if you can than trying to do something silly like contain Justin Jefferson. That feels like that's just a hope and a prayer, right? So I think that you do as much as you can to deter quick targets to Justin Jefferson. And then once you have reasonably accomplished that goal through clogging passing lanes or bracketing or whatever it is that you do, shorten the clock on these guys by sending extra pressure. Or, again, if your front four is very good, finding ways to attack whoever the left guard is going to be. So that's probably how I would do it, primarily. Obviously, you've always got to mix up your strategies. I think that, probably like, I don't know if Sam Darnold is better against zone or man. I think that that's probably not that important at this level anyway. I think it's more about disguise and taking advantage of the fact that these guys are not nearly as experienced or as good against safety rotations or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes it, to be honest, it's like so many teams' weakness is interior pressure, right? But it's like there are certain teams who are just more susceptible than others, and for different reasons. Like last week we were talking with a Lions writer, and he said interior pressure as well, but his reasoning was different. It wasn't because of a weak interior O-line. It was just because Goff is helpless against it, right? Goff doesn't have the superpowers to deal with it. And with the Vikings, it's a completely different reason for the same answer, which I really enjoy hearing. I think that it's interesting to hear that there can be two very different reasons as to why the same thing would be such a big weakness.
100%.
Yeah, I think it's always kind of fascinating to try and break down kind of like all of the reasons that you would do the same thing. And here it's just like, it's the path of least resistance. Why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah.
Now, flipping the script on this type of question that we're working on here, schematically, it's the Brian Flores defense. And now the common football fan might not know that, right? They might hear Brian Flores defense. Like, yeah, no shit, he's the D coordinator. Like, what's so special about it? But we as a little more hardcore football fans know a lot about it. Obviously, a lot of blitz, a lot of disguise. How would you describe it again to somebody not as familiar with the Vikings defensively, and how Brian Flores has been running it in Minnesota versus like his days with like Miami and New England?
So I expect it to change this year, I'll say that much. But the way that it was run last year was significantly different from Miami and significantly different from New England in one big respect. Aside from the fact that there was somehow even more blitzing than there was with New England and Miami, what was behind it was actually a lot of zone coverage. So with Miami especially, but also with New England, there was a lot of man coverage. You've got Xavier Howard when he's healthy, right? And why wouldn't you use that to the best of your ability? So you would shorten timelines on quarterbacks' decision making by forcing them to throw to like these mismatches where the cornerback was almost certainly better than the receiver. And you didn't have a lot of options available to you unless you were exploiting the man coverage with these rub routes, and it was tough to do that because you didn't have enough time because of the blitzes. Now here, you do have a lot of these blitzes, but I think there's a couple of differences here. One, I think, is that when you look at the blitz packages that we saw in Miami or New England, a lot of times these are like defensive back blitzes or blitzes coming from, the outside. And, I'm not saying that Donta Hightower isn't a phenomenal blitzer. He is. That's the thing he might even just be the best at, and he's already a very good linebacker. But Ivan Pace is like a uniquely talented blitzer and a uniquely untalented other thing, right? Like you ask him to do other stuff, he's just not nearly as good at it. And to Brian Flores' credit, he was like, all right, then he's just going to keep blitzing. Why would I concern myself with that? So
why change it if it's working so well?
Yeah, exactly. And so like with Donta Hightower, if you don't blitz him, yeah, you're probably fine. Right? Like he's in coverage and, maybe you're not maximizing him. But with like Ivan Pace, it's like, I don't know, man. Maybe he should be heading forward instead of backward. So you had a lot of blitzing up the middle with Ivan Pace. You had a lot of blitzing up the middle with your safeties, with Josh Metellus, right? Not as many edge blitzes. And there's differences, right? Where if you know the way that protection scheme works and you know that the running back is supposed to be picking up outside blitzers, then you've got, some advantages there. The Vikings have a strong history of inside blitzes because of Mike Zimmer and the double A gap blitz, which eventually turned into, a B gap blitz. But attacking that center and making a running back choose between, who that guy is has been a very successful strategy for every member of that defense for a decade, right? And so it's something they're familiar with. But it's also something where, as teams come up with answers to that, they have come up with counter answers to that. And one of the reasons that the Vikings would have this zone coverage behind instead of this man coverage is that you could beat those Miami blitzes and those New England blitzes with screen passes, because with man coverage, their eyes aren't at the quarterback, their eyes aren't facing forward, their eyes are on whatever their assignment is, and they might miss that with a screen pass. The Vikings were insanely talented at beating screen passes, right? And I think part of it was because their eyes were forward with these safeties, with these corners. And they were a strong tackling group. Like, the cornerbacks weren't very good at covering, which is a primary responsibility, but at least they were good at tackling, right? And because they forced quick throws, the coverage issue wasn't as big of a deal. So it was a lot of blitzing, a lot of zone coverage behind it, and then the twist on the zone coverage, of course, is that they would mix and match their zone assignments, flip them at the snap, and have different ways that they would parse out what those zone assignments were, to the point where 13 weeks into the season, people thought, offensive coordinators thought that they were in man coverage, and they weren't. They were in zone coverage. Again, I think that this was to hide a lot of weaknesses. And like I said, after week 13, things fell apart in a pretty big way. But up until people had kind of figured out what they were doing, it was really effective. Now, I think that that's going to change because they've done a little bit more to try and get at these weaknesses. They've added another linebacker in Blake Cashman, who's a very standard linebacker, like reasonably good at blitzing, reasonably good at run defense, reasonably good at coverage. It's just like the most standard guy.
Was he with the Packers for a while?
Cashman? I don't think so. I mean, he's another Minnesota alum like Devondre Campbell, but I don't think he was with the Jets most recently, and then he was with one other team before that, I think. But yeah, no, it's a very, like, he's just going to do linebacker stuff for them, which is not common for the Vikings, right? Like it's like Eric Hendricks a little bit ago, but other than that, it's like Anthony Barr and Brian Asamoah and Ivan Pace, and it's like, now we got a linebacker that does linebacker stuff again. So they're probably going to be changing the way that they approach their blitz packages, the way that they approach their coverage assignments. Josh Metellus is probably good at most of the things that they're going to ask him to do. So they can adjust whatever scheme it is for Josh Metellus. They can adjust whatever the scheme is going to demand for Harrison Smith and stuff like that. We'll probably see even more Harrison Smith blitzes and fewer blitzes from some of these other guys, and that might mean more edge blitzes. So these things will change, but he is a very aggressive coach in terms of blitzing. It led the league last year in blitz rate by like an incredible margin. Like, it's like number 1 and then number 2 and then number 3, right? Like 4 or 5, but like number 1's like way up here. So yeah, probably still going to be a lot of that, but a little bit less because a lot of it was to hide some weaknesses.
That's such a distinct point, that Flores is going to find what his guys can do, not lament over what they can't do. And that's such a, like, I feel like it gets overlooked by fans a lot, but it's something that's real in NFL coaching. There are some coaches who are not as flexible to what their players are good at, and some coaches who are extremely flexible to what their players are good at. And I almost feel like the coaches who are that flexible with what their players are good at and making it all work are harder to scout because they're less predictable, because they just find ways to make stuff happen.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from, his history of being a coach in New England, because that was like the thing that New England, had become extraordinarily good at, to the point where they would like ship off these players like Brandon Merriweather, right? Mm-hmm. And it turns out Brandon Merriweather is only good at like 1 or 2 things, and New England was like, those are the 2 things you're doing. And then some team is like, hey, you were really good, so we're just going to ask you to do normal safety stuff or whatever. And he's like, can't do it. Like, he's just not good at it. And I think that
he came to the Bears after New England. It was not
Yeah.
not a good time.
Yeah. It's like, you're a safety, right? So we'll just ask you to do safety. Nope.
Cover 2 safety. Boom. Go for it.
Yeah, it's like, and like that happened for like 2 decades in New England, and I think that kind of the DNA of coaching kind of stuck with him, and I think that like seeing how they would use somebody like a Jamie Collins, who, you know, was a really great pass rusher and really good at some aspects of coverage and not others. You know, when he went over to Cleveland, it wasn't there for him, right? Or Dante Hightower, who stayed there the whole time. He's a very particular linebacker on the things that he's good at and the things, you know, that he struggles with a little bit more. And they just kind of figured it out. The challenge, though, is if you have a bunch of players that are only good at a couple of things, it's difficult to come up with a cohesive system that accounts for all possibilities. If you've got 8 pass rushers and no coverage defenders, you're probably toast. So, like, there is
a get home fast enough.
Yeah, unless you get home, right? So there is a little bit of push and pull and a little bit of give, and I think that that's why the Vikings went out to pursue players like Blake Cashman, or why that they, you know, added somebody like an Andrew Van Ginkel, right? Because, like, if there's only a couple of things that you can do, sometimes we don't have answers to every problem. But if you can come up with a system that maximizes, you know, these guys that have narrow skill sets, then without creating a ton of weaknesses, then that's really what sets you apart, I think, both as a coach and like a scheme guy, and also as a guy who knows how to acquire talent at you know, at a good price, right? Because if you're not good at a ton of stuff, you're going to be a lot cheaper.
Now, this next one, I don't think it's as juicy as the first one, because I have a feeling by the time I'm thinking back to this, preparing for a Bears-Vikings game, it might not be relevant anymore because Brian Flores will have already faced it and already adjusted to it. But as of right now, how would you attack the Vikings defense?
I would probably start investing in like RPO style offenses. I think that a lot of people, you know, especially, you know, as we're watching some of these successful RPO offenses now materialize in the NFL, but previously in college, they're like, hey, you should just put RPO in it. That's actually really difficult. And you need to be preparing for it in the offseason, because the way that mesh point works, you have to have some chemistry with the running back. The way that those reads work, it's a little bit different than read option, and way different than, you know, the way you normally read a defense as a quarterback. The way those reads work is something you have to train your eyes and your brain to. So, you know, not every team can do this, and not every team is prepared to do this. But if I had a choice to prepare my team beforehand, anticipating a blitz-heavy Vikings defense, I would probably do some RPO stuff that it would constantly make somebody like a Blake Cashman wrong, right? You know, see if he's gonna, you know, attack the running gap, and then, you know, put a receiver behind him or something like that. And that's where you kind of hope that you've got, you know, maybe a versatile player like TJ Hawkinson, or some tight end that you're comfortable with both blocking and receiving, or a slot receiver that's comfortable with both blocking and receiving. KJ Osborne, Adam Thielen, both of them were really good at blocking as well as receiving. And so having that guy in the slot, allowing you to manipulate kind of how you're going to approach these things, is really important. You also have to practice it, because you have to get rid of the ball super quickly. Otherwise, you have an ineligible man downfield penalty. It's a much harsher cutoff in the NFL than it is in college, because you could be like 3 yards downfield or something crazy in college.
The first time that I was scouting the NFL draft, and I was just like, you know, giving my marks like good, great, neutral, bad, poor, I tried to mark those. I was like, well, that's going to be a flag for it. That's going to be a flag for it. And then I realized I can't, because they're all going to be marked as poor. They're going to tank these guys' grades.
Yeah, and they know that it's not a flag when they're playing or when they're designing the play, and so it's kind of hard to penalize them for like taking advantage of the latitude in those rules. But now you're just kind of left with I have no idea if they know how to play with the right timing on this, right? But yeah, it's definitely something that you have to practice. If it's not something that's going to be in your skill set, if your quarterback for whatever reason isn't going to be comfortable in RPO, maybe you just don't want your quarterback in shotgun that often. Maybe he's an under center guy. Then probably I would invest in like play action, and see if there are specific second level defenders that you've got the ability to manipulate and attack. And if you've got, you know, those corners or if you've got those receivers and tight ends that have the ability to really win over the middle of the field, take those hits and take advantage of the extra space, maybe have people who are good at reading, you know, the holes in zone coverage and stuff like that. That's probably the way that I would go about attacking it. But really, I think the way to counter the Vikings is to force those slower passes to take more time, or force those faster passes to take more time, or be even faster, right? It's one of those two, but you can't let the Vikings dictate the pace of your play. You're either faster than them or slower than them. And if you're slower than them, you've got to make them hesitate somehow, whether that's play action, RPO, or something else. And so you have to basically, out-deceive them or just outplay them. Like if you've got guys that are really good off of release, and the Vikings don't play a lot of press coverage, so it's not like you can just swim, move, and now you're open. But if you've got guys that have a really great release, emphasize that. You've got Keenan Allen. He's got a great jab step off the release. He's one of the better release receivers in the NFL. If he can force, somebody like a Caleb Evans who's inexperienced to get his hips moving the wrong way, then your quarterback hopefully is playing with a ton of anticipation, and you just throw it over his head and hope that Keenan Allen or whoever it is can catch up to run to it. So, but it's going to be specific to whatever your personnel are. But I think it's don't let the Vikings dictate the pace of play when you're on offense, because they're going to win if they do that.
Now, that was literally the perfect almost set how you ended your answer there, because with Keenan Allen in mind and some of these principles at play, how do you see the Vikings in 2 games this year faring against the Bears here in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I've built up a particular understanding of the Bears over the last 2 years, which has radically changed in these off seasons. They've added a lot of really talented players, and then of course there's a rookie that's already a big unknown, right? So it's difficult. I think the Bears, obviously they've built themselves up on both offense and defense. They unfortunately retained Jalen Johnson. I kind of wish they didn't do that.
We're happy about it.
Very, very happy.
Stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm gonna trust that, because rookie quarterbacks are really difficult to figure out. And rookie receivers as well. Because Keenan Allen is not as good as he was like 5 years ago. I'm going to say that though the Bears have a much better supporting cast around Caleb Williams than I've ever seen for a first overall pick in my life, and better than the Bears have ever treated their rookie quarterbacks, if I'm being honest, it's going to be difficult, but I do think that the Vikings, obviously, especially at home, but on a neutral field, would be favored without, having any context of the previous history of play from other games. So I would say they're probably good. I trust Justin Jefferson over Jalen Johnson, right? Like, and yeah, it's a pretty good safety group too. Like Jaquan Brisker is like good, But
there's actually some debate over that.
I think he's good. It's another one of those you got to play him the right way.
Yeah, but I think it's how much you value the run, stopping the run versus stopping the pass is where the question comes in.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that for the most part, I would trust the Vikings to win out. I mean, that offensive line has improved a lot over the last 2 years. I really like that tackle group. Having Aaron Jones in there instead of like Alexander Madison or a washed up Dalvin Cook, I think it's a pretty big upgrade. So I would say that the Vikings are advantaged over the Bears, but this is definitely a situation where there's enough uncertainty on both teams where anything could happen. It wouldn't really surprise me. The Bears will let the Vikings by 40 points and just be like, yeah, I guess that's where they're at now. It's like not a huge surprise, but if the reverse happened, I'd be like, yeah, Sam Darnold's been really good over the last 2 years. It just happens, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, to pull this back a little towards the Vikings side, who's one player on the Vikings roster that you think gets overlooked?
I think, we've talked about him a lot on this show, but I think it's Josh Metellus. Like, I think that Ivan Pace actually gets a little bit too much attention in Viking circles and maybe even outside of Viking circles because he's got that nice, shiny PFF grade. PFF's not wrong, but I think the way people are interpreting that grade is a little bit incorrect because of what I said earlier. They're asking him to do the stuff that he's good at. Now, as a grader, all you can do is grade the stuff that he's doing, and he's good at it, right? A similar thing happened with Anthony Barr, where he has a really high coverage grade, but it turns out, you're not sending him like deep, right? You're not having him patrol it deep. Like Eric Hendricks is just booking it back there, right? Yeah. Anthony Barr is like covering the flat and preventing screens, and he's
like
great.
No
at that.
one you've ever seen.
Yeah, he's booking. Right? He's going to the sidelines, and it's fantastic. He's killing some receiver. Great. But with Ivan Pace, it's like the same thing. With Josh Metellus, they'll ask him to do anything, right? And he's like, got it, I'm your guy. And that's an insane thing for like this 6th round pick from like 3 years ago that had never seen the field. I shouldn't say never, but like you barely ever seeing the field. Always like the 4th or 5th safety was like always a risk to get cut. I believe he was on the practice squad for a while. And because his position is pretty difficult to define, you can't really compare him to a lot of contemporaries, right? There's not a lot of, you mentioned that, dog or star or joker or whatever position you're going to call it. There's not a lot of those guys that are actually like good at it. Like you always draft like, oh, we're drafting Mark Barron and he's going to stop Jimmy Grant. And no, he's not. He's not good. The reason he's been asked to do everything is because he's not good at any of it, right? And that's true for a lot of these like jack of all trades guys. But he's also not as good as Derwin James, right? Derwin James, you ask him to do anything, and he'll do the hell out of it, right? It's a little bit different. So it's tough to place Josh Metellus because he's an insane utility switchblade, whatever, right? He's a Swiss Army knife. He's going to do whatever you want him to do at a reasonably high level, and he's not going to get Pro Bowl votes for it, because of just the way Pro Bowl voting works, or all pro voting works, is that you got to pick a position. And it's like, well, I'm going to pick Harrison Smith over it. Like he's a safety, or I'm going to pick, Luke Kuechly. I mean, he's retired, but like Luke Kuechly at linebacker, right? Like, why would I pick Josh Metellus at linebacker, right? So it's like one of those things where, because of the way that we have these conversations, it's pretty difficult to highlight somebody like a Metellus. But he is, I think, that guy that nationally gets overlooked. That is a really important core part of the way that this defense runs, and one reason it was so effective for so long, despite being talent deficient in some really important areas.
And I love that you bring up the PFF grade side of that, whereas it's what you're being asked to do, right? And the way that I always like to describe it is, I got a 95 in Algebra 1. That didn't mean I was about to get a 95 in calculus. It's different things, and they're graded differently.
Yeah, and one might suggest another thing, right? Like I was really good at calculus, right? I was really good at it, and I was dog water at linear algebra, which a lot of people will call like Calc 4 or whatever, right? Typically, people who are very good at calculus are generally pretty good at linear algebra, but it's not always the case. And we didn't know how good I'd be at it. Turns out not, right? It's just like these things can suggest things, right? Anthony Barr having a high coverage grade can suggest he's good at a lot of coverage tasks, but in reality, he's not. And sometimes that's just the nature of a system that we're using. Sometimes systems have limitations. That's nobody's fault, but it's on us to then, kind of interpret what we're given and kind of put it in the appropriate context. And Ivan Pace is a really good example of that.
I was going to say, I think too, like PFF plus film is like the old school. It's the old school versus new school, like data analytics, right? Like the numbers versus just the tools, right? It's the kind of the same idea. It's, hey, you could take the PFF grade for what it is, but understand when you flip the tape on, you notice that Anthony Barr's only playing sideline to sideline and maybe 10 yards, 15 max off the ball. Then you have a quicker understanding of, oh, okay, they're asking him to do a lot of shallow coverage, and he's really good at it. But again, it's all contextual, of course, at the end of the day. But taking this a little back here, because you mentioned, right, the amount of unknowns on both of these rosters, Bears as well as the Vikings coming into 2024. Perhaps the most unknown, a rookie quarterback, just like you mentioned. How do you think Caleb Williams is going to look? And I'm going to ask this in two phases. How is he going to look the first time against Brian Flores' defense? And how is he going to look the second time against Brian Flores' defense?
I mean, I think he's going to struggle the first time. I like him a lot. I think that he's a really great quarterback. There was like a hot take industry kind of developing before the draft. They're like, hey, maybe Caleb Williams isn't like all that good. Nah, screw it. No, he's great. But he's a rookie, right? So when I looked at, and I didn't look at a ton, more, I actually was watching him more the previous year because of Jordan Addison. But when I look at like what USC was doing, and I'm looking at the defenses that Washington has a remarkable defense, right? That Washington was putting together, that Oregon was putting together, that UCLA is putting together, and I'm looking at what they're doing, and I'm like, well, these are talented defenses. A lot of them are, and he's doing really well against them. but none of them are doing anything like what Brian Flores is asking the Vikings defense to do. Very few college defenses are, because it's insane. Why? Who does that? That's you have to be very confident or very damaged, maybe both, right, to do these things, right, consistently. And which my understanding is that like he learned from like Narduzzi, which makes it the second Vikings defense to learn a lot from Narduzzi. First at Michigan State, then at Pitt. Crazy. But you're just not seeing that kind of stuff in blitz packages in college all that often. And I think just being introduced really quickly to that kind of stuff is borderline traumatizing. And so I think the first time it's going to be a huge problem. And I think, honestly, the Bears are probably going to try to protect him from a lot of it as much as possible. That doesn't have to mean screen passes. Hopefully, for the Bears' sake, it doesn't. But, it could be a lot of pre-delegated reads. It could be a pretty run-heavy game. It could be a lot of, things to try and protect him. But at some point, it's going to be 3rd and 11, and the Vikings are going to send 8 guys at him, right? And then you're just like, well, it's up to you, my dude. Rome's out there somewhere, right? Yeah. So I think the first time it's going to be a bit of a problem, but I think the second time, the game will not just the game will have slowed down, but he'll have been able to kind of absorb the film and see from a bird's eye view what they were trying to do to him specifically, what his answers were available to him, what he could have done. And while I don't think that he'll do well the second time, I think that the difference between the two, based off of my understanding of who he is as a player, I think like. I watched a lot of him against UCLA specifically over the years, and he improved really dramatically against UCLA over the years, and they had a very similar defensive setup every one of those years. And I think that he tends to learn a lot from those experiences, and while I don't think he'll play well, I think that the difference between the two games will probably be a pretty marked difference that you can point to.
And to your to kind of bring it back to your point about how you would attack a Brian Flores defense, I couldn't help but think as you were saying that, a lot of RPOs. Caleb did a lot of RPOs and quick release. Caleb's got a pretty quick release. Like it felt like, okay, there's some good stuff. Then there's also some superhero mode stuff that will probably go disastrously against
he loves
Flores.
that stuff.
So it could go both ways.
Yeah. And I think that if the Bears approach kind of the development responsibly, they'll include a lot of the RPO stuff in there because it's something he was pretty successful at. They'll spend a lot of time on the scramble drill, make sure that the receivers and Caleb are on the same page because he's goated at that. He's so good at that, right?
Yeah.
So they'll probably spend some time on that, but take the stuff that you've installed in the offense to answer quick blitzes, see if you can expand on that for this kind of game in your game plan in the week ahead. And then, kind of hope for the best. But I think that because, the speed of these guys is just different. Like, I mean, Washington has a remarkable defense, but there's only so many people as fast as Dallas Turner, right? There's only so many people as fast as Jonathan Grenard. And, they didn't always play in the Pac-12, and now it's, because it's the NFL. It's like an All-America team on steroids. They're 28, right? They've been running track for 8 years, right? So it's going to be different. And even if you've seen this particular scheme, which he hasn't, or if you've seen these particular plays, which he probably hasn't, they're going to happen a lot faster, and it's just going to be tough.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's a very well layered answer with a lot of, it considers a lot of the degrees within it that are within football. But Arif, thank you so much for joining us, talking with us. Again, anyone who's listening, it's Arif Hasan, chief writer over at WideLeft.football. Highly recommend you go check out the website, WideLeft.football. Arif, are there any final thoughts you want to give us? Anything you're working on that you want to push out there to anyone who might be listening, or all of the above?
I recently wrote a piece, Is Jordan Love Any Good? I think Bears fans might like that piece. I'm not going to give away the answer, but I think they'll like the piece. And then I'm also going to have Is Jared Goff Any Good piece coming out, hopefully tomorrow. So by the time many people will have listened to this, maybe. Other than that, there is going to be a lot of Vikings focus. Obviously, I picked those two quarterbacks because in the NFC North. I've got, my most popular piece is this piece exploring the draft network. It's a really long piece, going into kind of the history of one of the titans of the draft industry. There's a bunch of different types of pieces over at Wide Left. So hopefully, people will find what they like there. All
right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you guys for watching, listening. however you're consuming it. Make sure to go check out ontapsportsnet.com for all your Chicago sports needs. We got Bears, Bulls, Cubs, White Sox, Blackhawks, and everything else Chicago in between. Thank you for listening. And Ron, you want to get out of here the only way we know how?
Bear down, baby.
Bear down.